Okay, so in the previous chapter, what we had done is we had focused on perfect competition, which was this kind of idealized world where um, with many buyers and sellers all selling a pretty much identical good, that in the long run, that the price would equal basically the total cost, such that firms, if they're perfectly competitive, don't make any profit in the long run. One of the things that we saw from that chapter was the idea that we would set MR equal to MC, or the marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, to find the profit maximizing quantity. And what we're going to do is we're going to use that same rule here in markets that are not perfectly competitive. So to remind ourselves, if we created a spectrum where we said perfect competition is on this end and monopolies are on this end, where monopolies are just a single firm selling a good, perfectly competitive firms, many firms all selling an identical good. What we saw here was that there was no pricing power here, and that there's total pricing power here. But regardless of the amount of pricing power they have, they all use this rule of finding the quantity by setting the marginal revenue equal to the marginal cost. And then what we're going to see as well in this chapter is that we've got monopolistically competitive firms and that we also have oligopolies. Where monopolistically competitive firms, there's many firms, many buyers, so in that sense it's like it's competitive, but it's a little bit monopolistic in the sense that they sell each a slightly different or unique good. And then in the oligopoly, they have a bit more pricing power, but that's because there's only usually no more than 8 different sellers of the product. And the way they set the price is a bit more strategic. Okay. So I've already talked about this. In the previous chapter, again, we had many buyers and sellers selling an identical good, free entry and exit, with the ultimate conclusion that the firms were price takers. And as I said, they have the graph that we drew, the side-by-side graph that we drew, was that, let's say that we're talking about apples, the fruit. That in that market, here's my demand, here's my supply for the whole industry. But that again, for my individual apple farm, or orchard, I guess, I take this price as given. Demand equals price equals marginal revenue. And then my marginal cost is shaped like a J. And that point right there is how I determine how much I'm going to produce. That was our story for the perfectly competitive firm. With the additional idea that in the long run, the average total cost curve looked like this, so that it was at its minimum right at that ATC as well. And so this firm would make no profit in the long run. Okay. And I'm not going to repeat this here. And I just basically drew this picture because what would happen here? In this story here, if this were the way that the graph looked, the problem would be is that if this were the industry and this were the firm, that because of profit existing, firms are going to enter the marketplace, that would mean that supply increases, which would mean my supply curve will shift to the right. And that's what you see, is that the price would be driven down, all the way down, and be drawn down further, right? Because it's going to occur in stages. We're not exactly sure, right, as we're doing this here, but it's going to occur. Until it exactly equals the average full cost. So the price falls until there's no profit to be earned. So what that leads us to then is talking about, like, how do we get these monopolies? How much are they charging? Why aren't they a good thing? And then again, we kind of spend a little bit of time talking about the two types of firms in the middle, those that are monopolistically competitive and those that are oligopolistic. Okay, so if any of you have ever played the board game Monopoly, you're not actually seeing a monopoly, even though it's called that, you're not really seeing that in the game. Here we're talking about a single seller who supplies the entire market. So for our examples that are obviously local, we actually have quite a few. There's two obvious ones. Two obvious ones would be Hawaiian Electric and Hawaii Gas, right? So if you need propane or any kind of natural gas service, that would all come from Hawaii Gas. And if you need an electric, that would all come from Hawaiian Electric. If you need water, we have monopolies in areas. So we have the Board of Water Supply that serves most of the island, but there are other parts of the island where it's served by obviously the Navy and others. Between the islands, there's only one way to move goods and services between the islands, and that would be Young Brothers, right? So Young Brothers has a monopoly on moving goods between the islands. And what we're saying there is that not only are they the only seller, but they're also selling a product where there are no substitutes. So in other words, what we're seeing that's different is that there is no free entry or exit, right? Typically, there is a restriction, something that stops others from entering the market. So it is the case that in the state of Hawaii, it is illegal to generate your own electricity and sell it to others for the most part. Interestingly, Governor Green in the legislature, so I'm making this lecture here in July of 2025, the legislature and Governor Green actually just signed into law um, an exception to this where if you generate your own electricity and you generate some excess, that you can sell it to another group of close, like-minded firms or households. But for the most part, right, it's the only firm. Just like in this case, the shipping service that Young Brothers provides is a unique service that no one else is providing. And the government protects or isolates that company from competition. That's where they get the monopoly power. On the other hand, typically that kind of monopoly is going to be regulated by the government because they are a monopoly. And what we're going to see is that monopolies charge then incredibly high prices. So what you're going to do is you're then going to structure things so that you're in your monopolistic structure, the firm just can't charge whatever it wants. So we know for the most part that with these monopolies, they have the ability to set the price and the quantity. The question would be, how do they set that quantity? Well, I already kind of told you how they're going to set that quantity. They're going to set the marginal revenue equal to the marginal cost, just like we did for the others. In terms of the price, it's going to be determined by the demand curve, with one little exception, and that would be if you're a regulated monopoly, like Hawaiian Electric. Hawaiian Electric doesn't have the ability to set their price at where the demand curve is. They have to go through the government to be able to get their price changes approved. Now, the only reason why you want to be a monopolist, because it's a lot of work, right? You have to, lobby quite a bit. I mean, if we look in the state of Hawaii, the largest lobbyist by far is Hawaiian Electric. Now, Hawaiian Electric, admittedly, is going through a tough time right now, right? They have to make significant payoffs for being kind of the primary cause of the Maui fires. But they obviously need to lobby quite a bit to be able to protect their monopoly position. What is it that makes them a monopoly? In the case of Hawaiian Electric, we would call Hawaiian Electric or Hawaii Gas or even the Board of Water Supply, we would call these natural monopolies. So a natural monopoly, it's either because they own the one resource and there's only that one source for that natural resource. And the examples here that were given is Alcoa and De Beers. Alcoa stands for the Aluminum Company of America. And it turns out that Alcoa has the access to the bauxite. It's a mineral that's essential for making aluminum. And so because they own that bauxite source, they're the only makers of aluminum. De Beers owns the mines in South Africa that generate a great deal of the diamonds. And so what else are you going to do, right? It doesn't mean that De Beers will always make money, right? De Beers, even though they have no competition for natural diamonds, well, people don't even buy natural diamonds as much anymore. Right now, they buy synthetic lab-grown diamonds, and that is competition. The other reason, though, like why would something like Hawaiian Electric be a natural monopoly? I mean, they don't own electricity, right? They don't have any particular insights, right? Anyone can generate. I mean, my house is generating electricity right now, right, through solar panels and whatnot. But Hawaiian Electric has, it's very expensive to run a utility, right? You've got to build the lines, you got to hire the workers, you've got to build some power plants, right? Because the sun's not going to always shine all day long. So it takes a significant amount of capital to build an electric company or the Board of Water Supply or Hawaii Gas. And so it makes sense to only have one company providing this kind of product. And right, especially when we think of what the advantage would be to having only one electric company, is the idea is that right, we know that, and we saw this in the last chapter, we know that the average total cost curve is shaped like a U, but the idea with the natural monopoly is that the low point of that U is so far out that if you were to divide this market into multiple firms, everyone would have much higher costs. And it turns out that that's the amount of Q that about the amount of electricity that the whole state needs. So it makes sense then to just have one electric company. And so we would call these then again our economies of scale, which then gives us our definition of the natural monopoly. A natural monopoly would be a monopoly that exists largely because it's the only way you achieve the lowest cost is by having a single firm. We get other kinds of monopolies. So I just, and I'm sorry that I'm using all these Hawaii examples. It's just the ones that kind of immediately come to mind. I just had to call Hawaiian Telecom. So that's who I get my internet from. Now, Hawaiian Telecom does not have a monopoly on the internet, right? We actually also have Spectrum here as well. But not to be too technical, but the two companies each have a different kind of monopoly, even though they offer the same kinds of goods. So let me explain this. Hawaiian Telecom offers TV service, they offer phone service, and they offer internet. Spectrum Cable offers the same three things. Okay. But as licensed by the city and county of Honolulu, only Hawaiian Telecom can provide like actual phone service, like, landline, plug it in your wall kind of phone service. And by the city and county of Honolulu, only Spectrum can offer like your traditional cable TV, the kind where you've got like a coaxial cable that you plug in the back of your TV. Then over time, over the past few decades, each of them have found workarounds. In the case of Hawaiian Telecom, it offers cable TV, but it's largely like a YouTube TV kind of thing, right? And Spectrum offers telephone service, but it's also like an internet-based service. So they're offering each other's products, but if you want a landline, you have to go through Hawaiian Telecom. And if you want traditional cable, you have to go through Spectrum. And the only reason why we have it that way is because they got a license from the city and county of Honolulu to do this. In some sense, it protects the public in the case of like having reliable phone service or reliable TV. But the consequence is that it does limit competition. And so then the city and county of Honolulu has used the internet-based TV service or internet-based phone service to not have the competition be limited as much. We have other licenses as well, right? And these would be like to practice medicine or law, or even to pick up trash in some communities is done by a single firm that gets a big contract. The other kinds of monopolies that we have would be for those who have a patent or a copyright, and those are typically lasting for, if I'm not mistaken, 25 years, I think is how long you get a patent to last. But again, if we take these kind of core, like these core things that a monopolist does, or defining features of a monopolist, is that it's a single firm that has high barriers to entry, and it basically makes the price. And the question would be, how does it make the price, right? How is it determining its price? Well, it's going to come from your kind of traditional demand supply analysis. To review for us, we saw in the previous chapter that the perfectly competitive firm, again, does not alter the price, right? To review, once again, the graph, right, is that in the industry, you have your typical demand and supply graph, which again gives you your horizontal demand graph for the firm. And again, they have no influence over the price. The moment you differ from that market price, you've got nothing. Here's our difference. The monopolistic firm is the industry, meaning If I own the apples, meaning I own the entire fruit, that right there is my entire market, my entire industry. So this graph becomes this graph. And notice what I did here. Here, demand equaled price equaled marginal revenue, but here, the marginal revenue curve is steeper than the demand curve. And the question would be why? Something we'll talk about here in a slide or two. But to give you the overview before you even have to see it, you can imagine here, I'm going to have a marginal cost curve that looks like this. And if I set MR equal to MC, I'm going to be right there. And that's how I'm going to get my quantity. And then I'm going to have to go up to the demand curve to find my price. That's how we're determining the price that's charged. I'm going to pause for a second here. So then we kind of see this difference here. This would be for the individual firms, the individually competitive firm, and obviously the monopolist, which is just a single firm. Their demand curve looks different, but then I would add to this as well that their marginal revenue curves are different as well. In the case of the perfectly competitive firm, the demand is the same as the marginal revenue, and it's the same as the price. For the monopolist, the demand equals the price, but the marginal revenue curve is twice as steep. They would each have the same marginal cost curve, and both kinds of firms would still set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. But what you can see is whereas that point is here, that point is here. And they would each determine the quantity, but then you have to go to the demand curve to find the price, which is here. Then look, for the monopolist, you have to go all the way up to the demand curve to get the price. And that's what you see right here. And so then that's what we see here. Both types of firms, their similarity would be where marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. But then I would add to that as well that the other similarity for these firms is that demand equals price in both situations. But then the difference is right here. Now the question is why is that the case? I don't think that this explanation that the book gives you is good enough. So let me just talk about it for a little bit. For a perfectly competitive firm, when they sell one more good, right, when the quantity goes up by one, they get to charge one more customer that same price. That would mean that the marginal revenue, MR, which is the change in total revenue over the change in quantity. If the quantity goes up by one, then the total revenue goes up by the price. Right? For the monopolist, it's different. And the reason why it's different is because when they sell more, when the quantity goes up, they have to lower the price. Why is that? Because that's the law of demand, right? Quantity demanded, they can only get more people to buy their good if they lower the price. But here's the thing, and this is the really important part. They have to lower the price to every customer, because who's going to want to pay that higher price? So they lower the price to get more customers, and then they have to lower the price to everybody. In a simple example here, if I sold 100 units at $1, then my total revenue was 100. If I sold 101 units, but the only way I could do that was to sell them at 99 cents, right? Then I'm going to take 101 divided times 0.99. Actually, the numbers end up being rounded so small. Sorry. And let's just add an extra one there. Sorry. I mean, it's still not big enough. I have to have a bigger price change. Sorry. Yeah, I don't want to use the numbers here. Sorry, I don't want to use the numbers because the numbers I'm using here, it makes it makes it seem too small. Let's just do a simpler example here. Okay, right. So when I produced 5 more units, right? So I went from 25 to 30. I had to lower the price to $2. That means that I used to have customers that I had used to have 25 customers that were paying me $4. Now those 25 customers only have to pay me $2. So that means that I have a price that's now $2 lower times the 25 units I sold. So I'm getting $50 less revenue from those original 25 customers I got. Now I got 5 more customers who are going to give me $2 more than I used to have, just 10, for a net difference of 40. And that's what you're seeing right here. That my total revenue went from 100 to 60, just because I wanted to sell more product. And if you look at this here in this much nicer looking graph, you can see here that as my quantity of customers, now in this case, the quantity is going up by units of 1,000. But every time I increase by 1,000, the only way I get it is by lowering the price, as you see. Price times quantity is giving me my total revenue. And pretty quickly, we can see that my total revenue is going down. Sorry, my marginal revenue is going down. Monopolist, though, again, follows the same rule that we've had before. They're going to determine the quantity by setting the marginal revenue equal to the marginal cost. Then, so they set MR equal to MC. Then at that quantity, they go up to the demand curve. And the price is always greater than the marginal cost, at least for the quantities that they're producing. Thus giving us a graph that looks like this. These firms make a profit, and that profit is possible over the long run because there is no free entry and exit. So MR equals MC right here. Go down to the quantity, that's how much I'm going to produce. Then I go up to the demand curve to find the price that I'm going to charge. And at that quantity, here is what my costs are. So the difference between my revenue and my costs, that difference would be my profit. So then we have our comparison. Our comparison being that monopolistic firms earn profits over the long run. They have significant amounts of market power, and notably as well, they produce less than the perfectly competitive firms. In fact, they produce less than an efficient amount. And this is occurring because the price is greater than the marginal cost. In essence, the monopolistic firm has an incentive to restrict output. And they do this because they want to be able to charge that higher price. And we can see that right here, right? That if this firm were perfectly competitive, then their demand curve would have also been their demand curve, which would have meant that they would have produced right here. Instead, they're producing less. But also look at this. The perfectly competitive firm would have charged also a lower price. So monopolists charge higher prices and they produce less. That measurement of that amount that they produce less, economists have a name for it, and we call that the deadweight loss. This is the biggest thing for the economist. The deadweight loss, let's see if they draw the picture for us. Yeah, they do. They will. Okay, so I'm not going to draw it out because it gets messy pretty quick. I'm going to use their graph when we get up to that point here. Let me pause here. So this deadweight loss represents that distance at which we're producing less than the perfectly competitive firm. If we look back at this, that would be the distance between these two quantities, the quantity that would have been produced if the firm were perfectly competitive versus if the firm were a monopoly. We go back to their pretty picture. Again, difference between if they were perfectly competitive versus if they were the monopolist. That's creating the height of the deadweight loss, which is this triangle right here. So the size of the deadweight loss is determined by the magnitude of the quantity reduction. Because under the perfectly competitive types of firms, this entire space would be the consumer surplus and this would be the producer surplus. That would be the consumer surplus area being the area below the demand curve to the price. Producer surplus being the area above the supply curve to the price. Here, consumer surplus would be that little triangle right there. And then the producer surplus would be that shape right there, the area above the supply curve to the price. And that's what we see right here. So we've got our deadweight loss. So when this firm was perfectly competitive, that entire triangle was consumer surplus. But now that the firm is a monopoly, this part is the consumer surplus. This is all deadweight loss. And then this blue part was transferred from consumers to the firm, because the firm, the producer surplus, is that shape right there. And then this just repeats what I just said, which is that monopolistic firms produce less, monopolies produce less, charge more, and they create a loss in total efficiency. So this is generally why we don't like monopolies existing in a society. And it's why we have a number of laws that stop monopolies from existing. And in general, what we see is that monopolies basically have an incentive to um, lock you in as much as possible, right? So they would have an incentive to say, well, what do you know, I mean, we see this especially with cable TV, which is kind of the point of this example here, which is, you know, if you only watch the news, you can't just buy the news stations. You have to buy all of the stations. And the company can just say, well, if you don't like it, you know, then just do without because there's no one else that you can buy it from. Right? You can be an old woman who has a cell phone with unlimited data, but if you don't text anyone and you just call people, it doesn't matter. You really can't buy the phone service without the data service. Or for all you youngins, right, you can't go the other way either, right, where you just buy data but not have phone service. Now, monopolistic firms tend to engage in what's called rent seeking, which is that they behave in a way where they want to keep their monopoly position. So I mentioned earlier that the biggest lobbyist here in Hawaii was Hawaiian Electric. That money that they're spending for that lobbying is all rent seeking, meaning that they're working hard just to keep their monopoly position. Um, that's not too difficult, right? Look at the amount of advertising that, for instance, Lockheed Martin um, engages in. Lockheed Martin is well, probably one of the world's largest, but certainly the largest in the US provider of military goods. That they advertise all the time to politicians. Not entirely clear why, because they are the only producer of, certain defense systems, but yet that's what they do because they want to just keep their monopoly position. It's their way of defending it. And then what that turns us to, right? So on the one extreme, we had the monopoly. On the other extreme, we had from the previous chapter was perfect competition. And now we need to talk about what is perhaps the most frequently encountered type of competition, and that would be the monopolistically competitive. So it's going to be partly monopolistic and partly competitive. The ways in which it's perfectly competitive would be that there are these low barriers to entry and that there's lots of different firms, but products are slightly different, right? And so just think about it. You go to a grocery store and you will see, right, that there's a name brand of Cocoa Puffs and then there's a store brand. That would be monopolistic competition, right? The pizza aisle, right, is like what half of a frozen food aisle, and it's all different kinds of cheese pizzas, pepperoni pizzas, some with rising crust, some without, some on cauliflower crust, some not, right? Slight product differentials. And then what you do is you hire marketing people and whatnot to basically inform others about what those differences are and why they're um, theoretically worth you spending more money or why you should pick that product over another. And again, these are just some of the kinds of examples of how we would see that, right? Different kinds of, you could have stores that are selling jeans, right? But those jeans are slightly different. Or even within the same store, you could have different brands of jeans, right? Target's got Levi's, they've got Wranglers, and then they've got their own brand, their store brand. Sometimes, though, the way that you differentiate your product is by its location, right? So if you're a conveniently located dry cleaner or gas station, even though you're selling the same gas that others are selling, this is what's going to distinguish what you're providing from others. And these don't have to be real don't even have to be even real differences. It just has to be what you've advertised to others as what you think the difference is. By that I mean, a generic drug versus a name brand drug. I mean, theoretically, they're the exact same drug, right? It's just that one is coming from, is the name brand, and because of that, there's a lot of marketing and whatnot, and the price is more. Monopolistically competitive firms spend a lot of money on advertising, and that is quite honestly the world that we live in, right? If we wanted to list all the differences between having an Android phone versus an iPhone, right? The differences are all pretty slight, yet, each of those types of firms do engage in a fair amount of advertising to show why theirs is better than the others, or why the others are worse. Yeah, look at that, 2%. 2% of annual economic output is all advertising, and all largely because we are selling these monopolistically competitive goods that need advertising to be able to get you to buy the good rather than something else. So what that means here is that the point of advertising for the monopolistically competitive firm is to show that your demand is a bit more inelastic. Meaning that customers really want your specific good. And that's what you can see here. The demand curve is becoming a little bit steeper, right? Which we can kind of interpret as it becoming a little bit more inelastic, or to put in other words, less sensitive. Quantity changes to price changes. What does that mean? That if I raise the price by 10%, that the quantity will go down just because of the law of demand, but maybe the quantity demanded only changes by 5%, right? This is falling by 10% and this is only falling by half, maybe because of the advertising. And again, the characteristics of this would be is that there are many firms, low barriers to entry, rather easy entry and exit, but because of these slight differences, each firm does have a little bit of pricing power. Not sure why they're showing a picture of this, because this is not monopolistically competitive. This would be an oligopoly. Why? Because you've got Coke and you've got Pepsi and you got Dr. Pepper, I guess, but you really don't have too many other soft drink companies. That's not monopolistically competitive. So I'm not sure why they're showing you that picture. Monopolistically competitive would be that we have like 50 or 100 different soda companies. I know they're developing new ones and whatnot, but there's not that many. The price will still be above the marginal cost. They will be to some extent still a price maker, but not as much as when you were a monopolist. You'd only be a price maker to the extent that you have some inelastic demand. And that gets us to the fourth type of industry, and that would be an oligopoly. The best example of this one would be the airlines or the automobile manufacturers. And what they do here is this is one of the unique ones where they're not setting their price or even their quantity according to any specific rules. Rather, what they engage in is a fair amount of game theory. They strategize based on what the others are doing, right? And the firms are then interdependent. what one firm decides to do for its quantity and price affects what others do for their quantity and price. How many firms? Generally more than one, but generally less than 10. Most of the time it's between 3 and 5 firms would be in your oligopolistic structure. These oligopolies, they could have similar products, but they could be differentiated. It doesn't really, we don't have to really know which of the two it is. But what you do need in an oligopoly is some barriers to entry. You need something to stop everyone else from coming in. Okay. This just kind of concludes this, but I just want to show you this structure. Right, that if we look at an oligopolistic structure, now I was going to say I'm going to fly from Honolulu to Los Angeles, a pretty popular series here. And let's say that I go on August 13th to the 20th. What we're going to see here are probably pretty similar prices, and we do. Right? And really the only differences would be is if what you're providing is different enough that you can't charge the same price, right? Because this one's got a connection, making the flight almost 3 times as long, whereas all the non-stop flights from all of the various airlines are all within, what, 25 to 50 bucks of each other. That's an oligopoly. You don't get too many outliers. Now, how does this look different? What if instead I was going to Kailua Kona? Here, what we see is that we've got now a duopoly, only 2 firms, Southwest and Hawaiian, competing with one another. And we see same structure where the price is relatively the same regardless of which one you're flying, but where the differences come is with how frequently you offer the flights, right? Here we're seeing that Hawaiian/Alaskan is offering the flights, looks like to be about every hour or so, whereas Southwest doesn't have as many flights each day. So here they're competing on the basis of quantity. And we would see that the car manufacturers are also doing this kind of thing as well. Okay, so it gives you kind of an understanding now of the different kinds of firms. This table 8.4, this will help you quite a bit when you get to exam 2, as well as just kind of understanding everything as a whole.